There was an old bookstore hidden deep in the heart of a city that barely noticed its own existence. It stood like an ancient relic, wedged between two towering glass monoliths, office buildings that blocked out the sun in the morning and sent shadows sprawling across the cracked sidewalk every afternoon. The bookstore was nothing special at first glance: dusty windows, shelves that groaned under the weight of forgotten tomes, and a peculiar smell of ink, paper, and time itself. To the average person, it was just another antique shop. But to Cien, it was home. Cien had been around for 1,000 years, give or take. He didn't know the exact date of his birth, or the year he was reborn, or whether the thing he called life was even real anymore. After all, who could count the days when the days themselves seemed to bend and twist like a broken clock? But what Cien did know was that he had seen enough of the world to become an expert in the art of pretending to be ordinary. And that was exactly what he was doing now, walking slowly between rows of old books, adjusting his oversized sweater that had once been far too large, but now fit him just right. His steps were careful, measured. He'd learned to be cautious. After all, 1,000 years of existence left you with a lot of time to think about what mattered, and most of the time, the answer was nothing. Or everything. It depended on the day. Today, however, Cien wasn't lost in his thoughts. Today, he had a mission. He was in search of a very specific book, a book that would lead him to something he never thought he'd encounter again: the Time Merchant. Cien had once been deeply entangled with the Time Merchant. He had witnessed firsthand the power the merchant wielded, how time could be bought, sold, and manipulated like a commodity. Fates could be rewritten with the turn of a page. Lives could be altered in the blink of an eye. But the price was always high. Cien had learned that lesson the hard way. There were, of course, those who didn't know the Time Merchant's true nature. Many believed he was just a myth, a figure in fables. But to Cien, he was a presence that had lurked in the shadows of his life for centuries, twisting his own fate, along with the fates of countless others. And now, after all these years, Cien was going to confront him. He moved toward the back of the bookstore, where the shelves were stacked haphazardly, as though time itself had lost interest in organizing them. His fingers brushed over the spines of old leather-bound volumes, stopping briefly at a particularly worn book that looked as though it had been read 1,000 times. He pulled it from the shelf, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt the weight of something familiar. But that feeling was gone as quickly as it had arrived, swallowed up by the next wave of time. The book he was looking for wasn't on the shelf. Cien didn't panic. He never panicked. But he did grow more intent, more focused. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, was watching him carefully from behind the counter. Cien had learned over the years that people were rarely as oblivious as they appeared, and this woman knew exactly what he was looking for. He approached the counter with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had nothing to rush for, because, in truth, he didn't. "I'm looking for something," Cien said, his voice soft but direct. The shopkeeper's eyes shifted from her book to his face. There was something calculating in her gaze, something that hinted at secrets she had no intention of sharing. "The Time Merchant," Cien said simply, as though he were asking for a cup of tea. The shopkeeper's hands trembled slightly. She set her book aside and stood up, her thin frame moving with surprising grace for someone of her age. "You're not the first to ask for him," she said. Cien didn't reply. He didn't need to. He simply waited. After a long, tense silence, the shopkeeper retrieved a dusty volume from under the counter. "This is the book you need," she said, pushing it toward him. The cover was dark, almost black, and the title was written in a language Cien had long forgotten. The pages felt like they belonged to a different time, one far removed from this moment. Cien didn't need to read the book. He knew what it was. And more importantly, he knew what it would mean for him to use it. "The Time Merchant has a way of making promises," Cien said, looking up from the book. "But he doesn't keep them. Do you know that?" The shopkeeper didn't answer. Cien sighed and nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "I have to find him. And I have to stop him." If it's not too late. The shopkeeper's eyes softened, just for a moment, before they hardened again. You're too late for some things. And far too early for others. Be careful, Xian. Time doesn't forget. With that, she turned away, as though their conversation was finished. Xian stood still for a moment, considering her words, then turned and left the store. The world outside was brighter than he expected. The sky was a shade of pale blue, and the streets were bustling with people who had no idea what was coming for them. For the first time in a long while, Xian felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps there was still a chance that he wasn't alone in this mission. It didn't take long for Xian to find her. He had been tracking her for days, watching from the sidelines as her life unraveled in ways that only the time merchant could cause. Her name was Lan, a woman who had never quite found her place in the world, who always felt as though something was missing, as though her life was stuck in the wrong timeline. When Xian first approached her, she didn't recognize him. He had changed, after all. He wasn't the man he had once been, not entirely. But there was something about his presence that made her trust him, a feeling deep in her gut that told her he knew more than he was letting on. You don't belong here, do you? Lan asked one day, as they stood on the corner of a busy street, watching people rush by, their faces blurred with the passing of time. Xian smiled faintly. Neither do you. Lan turned to him, her expression one of cautious curiosity. Who are you? A man who's seen too much of time, Xian replied. And a man who's here to help you find yours. She shook her head. My time's already been taken. I've spent years wondering why things don't make sense. Why I can't find my place in the world. You're saying you can fix that? I can, Xian said, but not without a price. Her eyes narrowed. What price? The price of understanding what was lost, he said softly. The price of time itself. The journey was never meant to be easy. Xian knew that. But even with 1,000 years of experience, even with his knowledge of the strange and unpredictable ways of time, he hadn't anticipated the weight of what they were about to face. The streets blurred around him, no longer quite the same as they had been. The city they walked through, once full of familiar faces and known paths, was slowly shifting, like it was being rewritten with each step they took. Xian could sense the changes before they happened, the way the atmosphere thickened, the sharp tang of the air, the slight distortion in the sound of footsteps. Time was buckling, bending, warping that it felt like they were walking through a dream. Or, perhaps more accurately, a nightmare. Lan, walking beside him, was starting to notice the changes too. She had been quiet for the past few hours, her eyes flicking around as though she were trying to piece together the world around her. They had entered a part of the city she didn't recognize, a place that didn't quite belong in the timeline they were in. Old buildings, long since abandoned, stood beside gleaming, futuristic towers. People wandered in and out of time, their faces flickering like images on a broken television. Some were standing still, stuck in moments that didn't quite make sense, while others hurried past, lost in their own realities. This isn't normal, Lan said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. Xian glanced at her. This is what happens when time is twisted. The edges blur. The worlds collide. She frowned. It feels like we're stuck in between two places. I don't know if I'm here or if I'm somewhere else. Exactly, Xian replied. The time merchant's power doesn't just alter lives. It alters time itself, and when that happens, it creates fractures. Gaps between realities. This place is one of those gaps. Lan swallowed hard, looking down at her feet as if she expected them to vanish into the pavement. But how do we fix it? How do we fix all of this? Xian's gaze softened. By finding the heart of it. By confronting the merchant himself. They pressed on, deeper into the heart of this fragmented city. Every street corner felt wrong, out of place. The buildings were decaying in some places and gleaming in others. The sunlight shifted from bright to dim, as though the world itself couldn't decide what time it was. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a towering stone structure in the center of the city, a building that seemed to stand outside of time, ancient yet impossibly modern at the same time. It was massive, built with intricately carved arches and sharp, geometric lines that shouldn't have existed in the same space. At its base, an enormous door loomed, its surface reflecting strange patterns of light. It wasn't a door you opened, it was a door you walked through, an invitation from time itself. Xian stopped in front of it, his hand hovering over the cold metal. He could feel the weight of it, the sense of power that radiated from the door. This was it. The place where the time merchant lived. Where time itself was controlled. "You ready?" he asked Lan. She nodded, though the uncertainty was evident in her eyes. "I think I have to be." He smiled faintly, pushing open the door with ease. It didn't creak, it didn't resist, it simply opened, as though it had been expecting them. Inside was a vast hall, one that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The walls were adorned with intricate clocks, each one ticking at a different speed, each one counting down to a different moment in time. At the center of the room stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, his features obscured by a hood. But even in the dim light, Xian could feel the power of the time merchant. It was an energy unlike anything else, a presence that seemed to wrap around everything, influencing it, bending it to his will. The merchant didn't speak immediately. Instead, he raised his hand, and the clocks in the room began to spin faster, their ticking growing louder, more frantic. Time itself seemed to freeze, then race forward in a blur, faster than any human mind could comprehend. Xian stepped forward, unfazed. "I've come to end this." The time merchant chuckled, a low, echoing sound that seemed to reverberate through the hall. "End it? You can't end something that has no end. Time is a river, my dear Xian. You cannot dam it. You cannot stop it. You can only guide it." "I'm not here to guide it," Xian said, his voice firm. "I'm here to take it back. To fix what you've broken." The merchant's head tilted slightly, as if considering him. "You always were the one who thought you could fix things. How many times have you tried, Xian? How many times have you altered fate, only to see it twist and break apart again?" Xian didn't flinch. "I'm not the one doing the twisting now. That's you. You've taken something that wasn't yours to play with." "And what if it was mine to play with?" the merchant replied, his voice smooth, almost persuasive. "You think you can fix the world by undoing what's been done? By resetting time? But what if all of it was meant to happen this way? What if this is the true course of events?" Lan stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "If it was meant to happen this way, why are we standing here? Why are we trying to fix it?" The merchant's laughter echoed again. "Ah, the girl with the questions. You think you understand fate, but you don't. None of you do." Lan clenched her fists. "I may not understand all of it, but I know one thing. I know I've been living in the wrong timeline. And I know I'm not the only one. You've ruined so many lives. You've rewritten so many fates." The merchant's expression darkened for the first time. "And what of your own fate, Lan? What of your life? It was never meant to be what it was. You were supposed to live a different life, in a different time. One that was, more." Lan recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" The merchant's eyes gleamed from beneath his hood. "I've watched you for a long time. Your life was never meant to be this way. You were supposed to be someone else, someone greater. But I gave you a chance to change, to be something else. And now you're here, trying to undo everything. But you can't, Lan. It's too late." Xian stepped forward, his voice steady but intense. "You've taken too much from her. From all of us. You've twisted destinies until there's nothing left but chaos." The merchant's smile returned. "Chaos? No, Xian. This is order. The way time is supposed to be. What you don't understand is that the world isn't meant to be fixed. It's meant to evolve. It's meant to change. I don't care what you think is meant to be, Xian said. I'm taking back the fates you've stolen. The merchant's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room seemed to crackle with energy. Time itself shuddered under the weight of their confrontation. Then we will see, won't we, he said, his voice low and dangerous. We will see if you can truly undo what I have done. And with that, the room erupted into motion, time exploded around them, the clock spinning wildly, the air thick with the crackling energy of the merchant's power. Lan and Xian were tossed backward, their bodies thrown against the walls as the force of the temporal distortion gripped them. The room seemed to fracture, as though reality itself was being torn apart at the seams. Xian could feel the pull of it, the pressure of the moment, the weight of his decisions, the cost of trying to turn back time. But this wasn't just about undoing the past. It was about something much bigger. Something far more dangerous, and as the storm of time raged around them, Xian realized that the true battle was only just beginning. The world trembled around them, a chaotic storm of twisting realities, splintering timelines, and unrelenting forces that were beyond anything Xian had ever experienced. His mind screamed for clarity, for understanding of how to fight this, a fight against the very fabric of time itself. The air crackled with power, and every step seemed to pull him in a different direction. The walls of the grand hall stretched out, warping as if the building itself was being disassembled, piece by piece, under the weight of the time merchant's force. Xian felt the pressure in his chest, the suffocating sensation that time itself had turned against him, that all the rules he had learned in his 1,000 years of existence were meaningless here. He was standing at the edge of something far greater than himself, and in that moment, he realized how little he truly understood about the forces that governed the universe. Lan was beside him, though she had been thrown to the floor by the shockwave of temporal distortion. Her breathing was rapid, her face pale, eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of something more, anger, determination. Xian, she shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of shattering time. We can't win this fight if we don't stand together. She struggled to her feet, her hand reaching out toward him, her fingers trembling. Her own sense of helplessness mirrored Xian's, but there was something deeper in her eyes now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. I know, Xian said, his voice hoarse but resolute. He grabbed her hand, pulling her close, shielding her from the next wave of temporal energy that slammed into the room. The time merchant stood, unshaken, at the center of the storm, his form still cloaked in shadow. But now, his eyes were glowing, shimmering with an unnatural light, a reflection of the infinite power that coursed through him. You think you can undo this? The time merchant sneered, his voice booming, resonating with the power of centuries. You think you can take back what I've given? You cannot stop me. No one can. Time belongs to me. It always has. Xian steadied himself, pulling Lan behind him, a protective barrier between her and the merchant's raw energy. You're wrong, he said. His voice was stronger now, tinged with something ancient, something born of his own 1,000 years of existence. Time doesn't belong to anyone. Not even you. The merchant's laugh echoed through the fractured room. You still don't understand, Xian. You never did. Time is a river, constantly flowing, endlessly changing. It's not meant to be controlled. It's meant to be experienced. Xian's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his own words sinking in. What the merchant said wasn't completely wrong. Time wasn't something that could be frozen or fixed, it was something that had to be lived, even in all its chaotic beauty and tragic consequences. But the merchant's arrogance, his belief that he could alter it at will, was a sin that Xian couldn't allow. That he stepped forward, his steps slow but deliberate, as the room seemed to fold and shift around him. Each movement was an effort, as though the very fabric of the space was fighting him, trying to push him back. But Xian refused to relent. "I've seen what you've done," Xian said, his voice steady. "I've seen the lives you've stolen, the fates you've rewritten. People don't get to choose when they live or when they die. They don't get to choose what happens to their souls." The merchant's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. The room surged again with energy, and time seemed to bend into impossible shapes as the merchant spread his arms wide. "You speak of choice," the merchant said, his voice laced with contempt. "As though it matters. People are bound by their fates, by the timelines they're born into. They cannot escape. You cannot escape. And neither can she." Lan felt a surge of panic rise in her chest as the merchant's gaze shifted toward her. Her body froze, her legs rooted to the ground as if an invisible weight had settled upon her. "No," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. The merchant's smile was cold. "Yes. You, Lan. Your life was never meant to be. You were supposed to be someone else, someone great. But I gave you the chance to live, to exist in this fractured reality. And now you want to undo it. But the truth is, you were never meant to be anything more than a shadow of what you were supposed to be." Lan's breath hitched in her throat. "No. I've had enough. I've lived enough of a shadow. I've been nothing but a puppet, dancing on the strings of your decisions. And I won't let you control me anymore." The words felt like fire in her chest, burning away the fear, burning away the uncertainty. She felt a clarity she hadn't known before, a deep understanding that her life, no matter how fractured it had been, was hers. And if she had to fight for it, she would, with a strength that surprised even herself. Lan stepped forward, breaking free from the merchant's oppressive influence. She stood beside Xian, her back straight, her eyes blazing with newfound purpose. "We're not your puppets," she said. "We're not your playthings. And we're not going to let you keep rewriting our fates." Xian looked at her, his heart swelling with something deep inside. For the first time, he didn't feel like the burden of time was his alone. Lan had found her own strength, and together, they were a force that even the time merchant could not ignore. The merchant's expression twisted in fury. "You think you can defy me? You think you can change time?" His hands raised, and the clocks in the room began to spin faster, their ticks turning into an almost unbearable crescendo of noise. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his power, and Xian felt himself pulled to his knees as the weight of time pushed against him, as if the very air were made of lead. But then, something shifted. Lan's voice, strong and unwavering, cut through the noise. "Time is not a weapon, and it's not yours to control. It's a story. It's our story. And we get to write it." The words were like a spark in the dark, igniting something deep inside Xian. His mind cleared, and he understood, this wasn't just about stopping the merchant. It wasn't about undoing everything. It was about choosing. Choosing to let go of the idea that time could be controlled. Choosing to embrace the chaos of it. The beauty in the struggle. Xian stood, his body shaking under the weight of the force around him, but he didn't falter. He reached out to Lan, and together, they stood firm against the merchant's power. "We may not be able to control time," Xian said, "but we can control our choices. We can control our fates." Lan nodded. "And we choose to fight." The merchant's face twisted in rage, but there was something else there too, a flicker of fear. Fear that they had found something he could not manipulate. The clocks began to slow. The air began to clear. The fractured reality that had consumed the hall began to stabilize, piece by piece. Time was slipping from the merchant's grasp, and though he fought against it, he was losing control. Xian and Lan moved together, their strength amplified by their shared conviction. They had found their power, not in resisting time, but in accepting its unpredictability. Time was no longer their enemy. It was their ally. With one final, unified push, they broke the merchant's hold over the room. The walls of the hall shattered like glass, and the endless clocks stopped their maddening ticks. The air grew still, calm, and for the first time in a long while, Cien felt the weight of 1,000 years lift from his shoulders. The time merchant was gone. His influence was broken. And with it, the world that had been so terribly twisted began to heal. Lan turned to Cien, her eyes filled with gratitude, her smile a quiet but powerful reflection of the journey they had shared. Cien, standing beside her, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A hope for the future, a recognition that no matter how fractured their fates had been, they had the power to shape them, to move forward together. And in that moment, Cien knew that time was not something to be feared. It was something to be lived. To be embraced. With that thought, they turned and walked into the future, no longer bound by the past, no longer afraid of what was to come.